Why does the Holy Bible, the sacred text of the Hebrew people, bestow its most revered title upon a foreign king? Why is a ruler from Iran, a man who worshipped different gods and built a worldly empire, called the Anointed One, the Messiah of the God of Israel? The answer is not a simple footnote in history. It is a story of divine sovereignty, human ambition, and a promise whispered in the darkest of times, a promise that would reshape the world. Our story begins not in the halls of a palace, but in the dust and despair of exile. The year is 548 BC. For nearly 4 decades, the soul of a nation has been held captive. The once proud people of Judah now live as ghosts in the shadow of the world's greatest metropolis, Babylon. An old man named Daniel, his back stooped, not just by age but by the weight of memory, stood on a stone bridge overlooking the Chebar Canal. The water, murky and slow, reflected the colossal splendor of the city. The Ishtar Gate, a marvel of brilliant blue-glazed brick, shimmered in the distance, its dragons and bulls seeming to mock the captives with their silent, ageless power. The great ziggurat, the Etemenanki, clawed at the sky, a man-made mountain dedicated to the god Marduk, a constant reminder of whose god was now supreme. The air was thick with the scent of strange incense, the cacophony of 100 languages, and the guttural shouts of Babylonian guards. To the conquerors, this was the center of the universe. To Daniel and his people, it was a beautiful, suffocating cage. He closed his eyes, and the glittering city vanished. In its place, he saw Jerusalem, not the pile of rubble it had become, but Jerusalem as it lived in his heart. He saw the white stone of the Temple of Solomon catching the morning sun, heard the chanting of the Levites, smelled the holy incense of the sanctuary. He remembered the joyous festivals, the sense of a people anchored to their God and their land. Then the vision soured. The memory of the siege returned, the starvation, the screams, the relentless pounding of the Babylonian siege engines. He saw the holy temple engulfed in flames, its golden vessels, the very cups and plates used for the worship of the one true God, looted and carted off as trophies for a pagan king. A profound sorrow, cold and familiar, settled over him. They had lost everything. Their king was a prisoner, their city a ruin, and their temple, the very place where God had chosen to dwell among them, was gone. Their identity had been shattered. Many of the younger generation born in Babylon were beginning to forget. They adopted Babylonian names, spoke the language of their captors, and were tempted by the allure of its powerful gods. The faith of their fathers was fading, becoming a collection of old stories told by weary men. Had God abandoned them? Had the covenant been broken forever? This was the question that haunted their nights and poisoned their days. But even in this profound darkness, a flicker of a forbidden hope survived. It was a hope kept alive not in public squares, but in quiet rooms behind closed doors where families would gather in secret. That evening, Daniel made his way through a labyrinth of dusty alleyways to a small, unassuming house. Inside, a dozen figures were gathered in a room lit by a single oil lamp. The air was tense with a mixture of fear and anticipation. A young scribe, Baruch, unrolled a precious, worn scroll on a low table. It was one of the few they had managed to save from the flames of Jerusalem, the prophecies of the great Isaiah. Baruch's voice was a low, urgent whisper, but it filled the room with a power that defied the mighty empire outside. He read from the latter part of the scroll, words penned generations earlier, yet speaking directly to their present anguish. But now this is what the Lord says, she who created you, Jacob, he who formed you, Israel. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. A collective sigh went through the room. These were words of comfort, a balm on their wounded souls. But then the prophecy took a startling, almost unbelievable turn. It began to speak not of the past, but of the future. It spoke of a liberator, a savior, and it gave him a name. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him and to strip kings of their armor, to open doors before him so that gates will not be shut. A stunned silence fell upon the room. Cyrus? Who was Cyrus? The name was foreign, Persian. He was a minor king of a remote mountain kingdom called Anshan, a vassal state subject to the powerful Median Empire to the north. To the exiles in Babylon, he was a nobody, a distant rumor on the fringes of the political world. How could this obscure figure be their deliverer? And more shocking, how could the scroll call him God's Anointed One, the Mashiach? That title was reserved for their own holy kings, for David and his descendants. It was the title of the promised Messiah. To apply it to a pagan foreigner seemed a blasphemy. Some in the room shifted uncomfortably. Was this truly the word of God, or the ramblings of a prophet driven mad by grief? It made no sense. God worked through his chosen people, not through pagan warlords. But Daniel listened, and a different feeling stirred within him, a sense of awe. This was the very nature of their Gotto work in ways that confounded human wisdom. He had used a flood to cleanse the world, a shepherd boy to defeat a giant, and a stuttering exile to liberate his people from Egypt. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was about to do it again. Perhaps the key to their salvation would not come from within their own broken community, but from the most unexpected of places. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the east, in the rugged, windswept highlands of Persia, that very man, Cyrus, stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking his capital, Pasargadae. He was not a man given to grand pronouncements or brutal displays of power like the Babylonian kings. His was a quieter, sharper intelligence. He watched the movements of merchants on the trade routes, listened to the reports of his spies in the courts of Media and Babylon, and studied the weaknesses of his rivals. He saw the Babylonian Empire, for all its golden splendor, as decadent and brittle. He saw the Median Empire, which he served, as fractious and poorly led. He felt a destiny stirring within him, a conviction that a different kind of empire was possible, a one built not merely on terror and tribute, but on a foundation of stability and even a measure of respect for its diverse peoples. He did not know that his name was being whispered in secret gatherings in Babylon. He did not know that a God he did not worship had already laid claim to his life, weaving his ambitions into a divine tapestry far grander than any he could imagine. He was simply a man on the cusp of greatness, his eyes fixed on the horizon, unaware that he was about to become the answer to a prayer he had never heard. The stage was set. The captives wept, the prophet's words echoed, and the chosen instrument of God was preparing to march. In the weeks that followed the secret reading, the name Cyrus hung in the air of the Jewish quarter like a ghost. It was a seed of prophecy planted in the barren soil of their exile, and for most it refused to sprout. The initial shock had given way to a weary cynicism. A Persian, a young scribe named Ezra, muttered to Daniel one afternoon as they repaired fishing nets by the canal. His hands, though skilled with a stylus, were clumsy with the rough cordage. "Daniel, I honor your faith, but you must see the madness of it. The Lord's anointed? The Messiah? Our Messiah is to be a son of David, a lion from the tribe of Judah, not a mountain wolf from Anshan." The prophet must have been speaking in metaphors, of a spiritual deliverance, not a literal one. Daniel looked at the young man, his eyes full of a wisdom that was both ancient and patient. And was the flood a metaphor, Ezra? Was the parting of the Red Sea a spiritual symbol? Our God is the God of history. He writes his will upon the earth with kingdoms and with kings. We are not asked to understand how, only to watch and to believe that he who made the promise is faithful to perform it. Ezra fell silent, but his skepticism was shared by nearly everyone. Life in Babylon went on. The whips of the taskmasters still cracked, the taxes were still collected, and the glory of King Nabonidus and his regent son Belshazzar seemed as unshakable as the city walls. The prophecy of Isaiah was once again relegated to a desperate hope, a story for the dark, not a reality for the daylight. But far to the east, the gears of that reality were beginning to grind. Cyrus, king of Anshan, had become a problem for his grandfather and overlord, Astyages, the aging and increasingly paranoid king of the Medes. Astyages ruled from his magnificent capital at Ecbatana, a city of immense wealth and power. He saw the growing influence of his Persian vassal not as a strength to his empire, but as a dagger pointed at its heart. He had heard the whispers of Cyrus's ambition, of the loyalty he commanded, and of the disciplined army he was building. The time had come, Astyages decided, to put the young upstart back in his place. He summoned Cyrus to court. It was not an invitation but a command. Cyrus travelled from the rustic simplicity of Pasargadae to the opulent, cold grandeur of Ecbatana. He walked into the throne room, a vast hall of polished stone and heavy tapestries, and found Astyages reclining on a throne of ivory and gold, surrounded by guards whose gilded armor gleamed menacingly. "Grandson," Astyages began, his voice dripping with condescension, "I hear you play at being a great king in your dusty corner of the world. You train soldiers, you build fortifications. Tell me, who do you imagine you are fighting?" Cyrus met the king's gaze without flinching. His attire was simple, that of a warrior, a stark contrast to the silken robes of the Median court. "I fight for the security of your empire, my king. I train my men so that the enemies on our eastern borders, the wild tribes of the salt deserts, do not trouble the peace of the Medes and the Persians." A cruel smile played on Astyages' lips. "A noble answer. But I fear your security has made you proud. Perhaps a reminder of your station is in order." He gestured to a servant, who brought forward a ceremonial dagger on a silk cushion. "This was the dagger of your father Cambyses, a loyal servant of Media. I trust you will be the same. To prove it, you will disband half your army and send their commanders here, to Ecbatana, to learn the ways of a proper Median court." It was an ultimatum wrapped in an insult. To obey would be to cripple his power base, to hand over his most loyal men as hostages. To refuse would be an open declaration of war. The entire court held its breath, expecting Cyrus to prostrate himself and beg for mercy. Instead, Cyrus gave a slow, deliberate bow. "Your wisdom is great, O king. I will return to my people and deliver your command." As Cyrus rode south, he knew his life, and the future of his people stood on a razor's edge. But he was not alone. The cruelty of Astyages was legendary, and he had made many enemies. One of them was his own chief general, a man named Harpagus. Years earlier, in an act of horrific vengeance for a minor offense, Astyages had murdered Harpagus's only son and secretly served the boy's flesh to him at a royal banquet. Harpagus had swallowed his grief and his rage, serving the king with a mask of loyalty, but waiting for the moment to exact his revenge. That moment was Cyrus. Secret messages had been passing between them for months, sewn into the belly of a hare and carried by a trusted hunter. When Cyrus returned to his army, he did not give Astyages command. Instead, he assembled his generals, the immortals, his elite fighting force. He held up a single Persian eagle feather. "For generations, we have flown under the banner of the Median bull," he declared, his voice ringing with a new authority. "We have been their shield, their sword, their servants. Astyages now demands we break our own wings. I say the time has come for the eagle to fly on its own." A roar of approval shook the mountains. It was rebellion. The war was swift and decisive. Astyages, enraged, marched his vast Median army south, confident he would crush his grandson in a single battle. He placed Harpagus in command of the main cavalry wing, a fatal mistake. At the critical moment of the first major engagement, as the armies clashed on the plains of Pasargadae, Harpagus gave a signal. He and his entire division of elite horsemen wheeled around and charged not the Persians, but their own Median infantry. The betrayal was absolute. The Median army, struck from the front by the ferocious Persians and from the flank by their own cavalry, collapsed into chaos. The prophecy of Isaiah, whispered in a dark room in Babylon, was now being written in blood and iron under the Persian sun, to subdue nations before him and to strip kings of their armor. Astyages was stripped of his army and soon after captured. Cyrus the vassal had overthrown his master. He was no longer just the king of Anshan, he was the king of the Medes and the Persians, the ruler of a new, unified empire. News of this stunning upheaval traveled like a shockwave along the trade routes. In Babylon, it arrived first as a garbled rumor told by a spice merchant. There is war in the eastern mountains. The Medes are fighting amongst themselves. But then, An official Babylonian envoy, returning from Ecbatana, brought the undeniable truth. He spoke to a hushed crowd in the city's main forum. The Median Empire is no more. King Astyages is a prisoner. A new power has risen. He is a Persian. They call him Cyrus. In their hidden prayer rooms, the Jewish exiles looked at one another, their cynicism dissolving into a terrifying, breathtaking wonder. The obscure name from the scroll was no longer a mystery. It was the name of the most powerful new monarch in the world. Daniel stood by his window, looking toward the east. He couldn't see the mountains of Persia, but he could feel the shift in the world's axis. The first gate, the one that had seemed impossibly barred, had been thrown open. The hand of God was moving, and its shadow was beginning to fall upon the golden walls of Babylon itself. The rise of Cyrus sent tremors of anxiety through the Babylonian court. For decades, they had been the undisputed masters of the known world. Their only real rival, the Median Empire, had been a known quantity, powerful but predictable. This new Persian king was an enigma. He moved with a speed and strategic brilliance that was unsettling. After consolidating his control over the Median territories, he didn't rest. He turned his attention west, toward the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Lydia in modern-day Turkey, ruled by the legendary King Cyrus, a man whose name was synonymous with gold. Belshazzar, the regent of Babylon, watched these events with a mixture of arrogance and unease. He stood on the highest terrace of his palace, sipping sweet wine from a golden goblet, listening to the reports of his spies. "Let the Persian exhaust himself with the Lydians," he sneered to his council of ministers. "Croesus is no fool. His cavalry is the finest in the world, and his treasury is bottomless. They will bleed each other dry, and we will remain supreme." His ministers nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting their master's confidence. They put their trust in Babylon's defenses. The city was a fortress unlike any other. Its outer walls were so thick that a four-horse chariot could race along the top. Inside this perimeter was another, equally formidable wall. The mighty Euphrates River flowed directly through the center of the city, not only providing an endless supply of water, but also acting as a natural moat, its banks fortified with yet more walls and dozens of massive bronze gates that led from the city streets down to the water's edge. To the Babylonians, their city was not just a stronghold, it was inviolable, a gift from the gods that no mortal army could ever conquer. In the Jewish quarter, however, the news of Cyrus's continued success was consumed with a different kind of intensity. Each victory was a fresh gust of wind on the embers of their hope. Ezra, the young scribe who had once been so skeptical, now spent his days poring over the scrolls, his fingers tracing the ancient words of Isaiah. "I will go before you and will level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron. I will give you hidden treasures, riches stored in secret places." Isaiah 45:2-3. "He is doing it, Daniel," Ezra said, his voice filled with an almost frantic awe. "It's all happening. The Lydian campaign. They say Croesus consulted an oracle that told him if he crossed the Halys River to fight Cyrus, a great empire would be destroyed. He thought it meant Cyrus's empire, but it was his own." The story of Cyrus's victory over Lydia was indeed miraculous. He had faced the Lydian cavalry on an open plain and neutralized their advantage by ingeniously placing his camels at the front of his line. The Lydian warhorses, terrified by the unfamiliar smell of the camels, bolted in panic, shattering the charge. Cyrus had pursued Croesus back to his capital Sardis, a city famed for its impenetrable citadel, and captured it through a daring feat. A Persian soldier found a hidden, unguarded path up the sheer cliffs. Just as Isaiah had prophesied the leveling of mountains and the discovery of secret places, Cyrus had seized the legendary Lydian treasury, the hidden treasures the prophet spoke of. The world was holding its breath. There was now only one great power left standing between Cyrus and total domination of the Near East, Babylon. Belshazzar, however, refused to be intimidated. His arrogance grew in proportion to the threat. To show the world and perhaps to convince himself of his unshakable power, he decided to host a magnificent feast. It would be a display of Babylonian might and divine favor, a grand spectacle to mock the ambitions of the upstart Persian. He commanded that the feast be held in the grandest banquet hall of the palace. 1,000 of his lords, his ministers, his wives, and his concubines were summoned. The hall was a kaleidoscope of splendor, lit by 1,000 scented lamps that cast a golden glow on the polished marble floors and the rich tapestries depicting the triumphs of Babylonian kings. The tables groaned under the weight of exotic foods and endless jars of the finest wine. As the night wore on and the wine flowed freely, Belshazzar's hubris reached its peak. In a fit of drunken bravado, he decided to commit the ultimate act of sacrilege, an act that would demonstrate his utter contempt for the conquered peoples of his empire and their powerless gods. "Bring me the sacred vessels," he roared, his voice slurring, "the ones my great predecessor Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple in Jerusalem. We shall drink to the glory of Marduk from the cups of the Hebrew god." A chill went through some of the older lords who remembered the power and piety of Nebuchadnezzar, but no one dared disobey. Servants scurried to the royal treasury and returned bearing the holy artifacts, the golden goblets, the silver bowls, the very instruments used in the worship of the God of Israel. They were filled with wine and passed among the drunken nobles who raised them high. "Praise to Marduk, god of gold," they shouted. "Praise to Ishtar, goddess of silver. Praise to the gods of wood and stone who give us victory." They drank deeply, their laughter echoing through the vast hall, a blasphemous chorus mocking a god they believed was defeated and forgotten. In that very moment a hush fell over the room. The music stopped. The laughter died in their throats. Every eye was drawn to a single spot on the great plastered wall opposite the king's throne. There, in the flickering lamplight, a hand appeared. It was not a hand attached to an arm or a body. It was a disembodied hand, fingers extended, moving with a calm, terrifying deliberation as it began to write upon the wall. The fingers glowed with a faint ethereal light, and the sound of them scraping against the plaster was the only sound in the cavernous hall. Belshazzar watched, his face draining of all color. The goblet slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. His knees began to knock together, and a cold sweat beaded on his forehead. The hand wrote 4 words in a script no one recognized, and then, as mysteriously as it had appeared, it vanished. Panic erupted. The king shrieked for his wise men, his enchanters, his astrologers, and his Chaldean sorcerers. They rushed in, their faces pale with fear. "Read it," Belshazzar screamed, his voice a ragged whisper. "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain placed around his neck, and be made the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom." But none of them could. The script was alien. The words were meaningless to them. They stared at the glowing inscription, their famed wisdom utterly useless. The king's terror deepened, his grand feast turning into a carnival of fear. Then the Queen Mother, who had not been at the feast but had heard the commotion, entered the hall. She was old and remembered the days of Nebuchadnezzar. "O king, live forever," she said, her voice calm amidst the chaos. "There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your predecessor, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. The king named him chief of the magicians. He is Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah. Call for him. He will tell you what the writing means." Daniel was summoned. He walked into the hall, an old man in simple robes, an island of serene dignity in a sea of drunken, terrified opulence. He looked not at the king, but at the golden vessels from his temple, now stained with wine and strewn across the floor. A deep sadness, but no surprise, was in his eyes. "You have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven," Daniel said, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the fear. "You have desecrated his holy vessels. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore he has sent the hand that wrote this inscription. He turned his gaze to the glowing words on the wall. For the first time that night, they were read aloud. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. This is what these words mean, Daniel proclaimed, and the fate of an empire was sealed in his interpretation. Mean. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Parsin. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The prophecy of Isaiah, whispered in secret, was now written in fire on the palace wall. The Anointed One, the instrument of God, was no longer a distant threat. He was at the gates. And that very night, as Belshazzar's kingdom was being weighed and found wanting, the waters of the great Euphrates River began to recede. Cyrus had arrived. While Belshazzar and his court descended into a drunken nightmare, Cyrus and his army were executing a plan of breathtaking audacity. For months, his engineers and thousands of soldiers had been working tirelessly on a massive project miles upstream from Babylon, hidden from the view of the city's sentinels. They were digging a colossal canal, a new channel designed to divert the flow of the mighty Euphrates River into a vast, marshy basin. It was a feat of engineering on a scale never before attempted, a secret weapon aimed at the very heart of Babylon's seemingly invincible defense. Cyrus stood on a temporary wooden tower, his gaze fixed on the dark, sprawling silhouette of the city against the starlit sky. He could hear the faint sounds of the festival, the distant music, the drunken shouts drifting on the night air. A smile touched his lips, not of cruelty but of grim satisfaction. He had baited the trap perfectly. His spies had informed him of the great feast, knowing that on such a night the city's guard would be at its most lax, its leaders lost in revelry. His chief engineer, a grizzled Persian named Gobryas, who knew the land better than any man alive, approached him. "The final dam is ready, my king. The basin is prepared. On your command, we will breach the riverbank." Cyrus nodded, his eyes never leaving the city. "The prophets of my people speak of the water god Anahita," he said, more to himself than to Gobryas. "But tonight I feel a different power at work, a power that stills the waters and opens the way. Give the order." The command was relayed down the line. With a great shout, thousands of men heaved on giant levers and cut through the final retaining wall of earth. The sound was not a dramatic explosion, but a deep sucking groan as the Euphrates, the lifeblood of Babylon, was suddenly torn from its ancient path. The powerful current faltered, and the vast volume of water began to pour sideways into the newly dug basin. The river that flowed through Babylon was being bled dry. Inside the city, the party had dissolved into chaos following Daniel's chilling interpretation. Belshazzar, though terrified, made a desperate attempt to maintain his authority. True to his word, he had Daniel clothed in purple, a chain of gold placed around his neck, and proclaimed him the third ruler of a kingdom that now had only hours left to exist. It was an empty gesture, a king playing dress-up on the precipice of his own doom. The lords and nobles, sobered by terror, stumbled out of the banquet hall, their minds reeling. The city was gripped by a nameless dread. Down by the riverfront, a Babylonian guard named Kidin, a veteran of many small campaigns, leaned on his spear and stared at the water. Something was wrong. The current, usually so swift and strong, was sluggish. He peered over the stone embankment. The water level was dropping. He could see the slimy, muddy riverbed beginning to emerge near the bank, a sight he had never witnessed in his 30 years of service. "Look," he called to his companion, a younger soldier named Rimut. "The river, and it's shrinking." Rimut scoffed. "You've been sampling the festival wine, old man. It's just a strange tide." "The Euphrates doesn't have tides," Kidin retorted, his unease growing into alarm. He looked at the massive bronze gate in the wall just beside them. This gate, like dozens of others along the river, was meant to allow citizens access to the water. They were supposed to be barred and locked at night. But tonight, in the carelessness of the city-wide festival, many had been left unfastened. It had seemed an insignificant oversight, Who could possibly attack from the riverbed? Miles upstream, the plan entered its next phase. As the water level in the main channel dropped, a path began to emerge. It was not a dry road, but a treacherous, thigh-deep morass of mud and swirling water, but it was a path. Cyrus's most elite troops, the Immortals, led by the vengeful Median general Harpagus, began their descent into the darkened riverbed. They moved in eerie silence, their feet sinking into the sludge. The stench of the exposed mud was overwhelming. This was not the glorious charge of cavalry on an open field. This was a stealthy, desperate infiltration, an army moving through the city's sewers. Harpagus, his heart pounding with a mixture of hatred for Babylon and exhilaration for the battle to come, held up a hand. "No sound," he whispered, his voice a guttural rasp. "The gods of this city are asleep. Let us not wake them." They sloshed forward, following the river's course as it curved into the heart of the sprawling metropolis. They moved under the massive bridges, shadows passing under shadows. The towering walls of Babylon loomed over them on both sides, making them feel like insects crawling at the bottom of a canyon. Their fate depended entirely on two factors: the continued distraction of their enemies and the criminal negligence of the gatekeepers. Back at his post, Kidin the guard could now see a wide expanse of exposed riverbed. Panic seized him. "Rimut, sound the alarm. Something is happening." But before Rimut could even raise his horn, a shape emerged from the darkness of the riverbed below. Then another and another. Dark figures covered in mud were climbing the slick embankment. The first was a giant of a man with a wild beard and eyes that burned with cold fire. It was Harpagus. He reached the top of the embankment and, with a single, powerful motion, drove his short sword through Kidin's chest. Rimut stared for a second in disbelief before another Persian soldier vaulted over the wall and silenced him forever. The first gate was open. The scene was repeated all along the river. Small teams of Immortals, moving with lethal precision, swarmed up the riverbanks and overwhelmed the few guards who were still at their posts. They found the bronze gates just as their spies had reported. Unlocked. They swung the massive doors inward, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The prophecy was being fulfilled in the most literal way imaginable. To open doors before him so that gates will not be shut. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron. The silent, muddy infiltration was over. The invasion had begun. Streams of Persian soldiers poured through the opened gates, fanning out into the sleeping streets of the city. The element of surprise was total. The main Babylonian army was garrisoned near the great outer walls, expecting a conventional siege, not an attack from within. The city's internal defenses were caught completely unaware. The first screams echoed through the night as the Persians fell upon the district garrisons. The sound of fighting, at first isolated, began to spread like wildfire. The citizens of Babylon, roused from their drunken or fearful sleep, looked out their windows to see their streets filled with foreign soldiers. Panic turned to terror. The inviolable city had been breached. In the palace, Belshazzar heard the sounds of battle drawing closer. The shouting was no longer celebratory. It was the sound of slaughter. He drew his ceremonial sword, his hands trembling. His royal guards formed a desperate last-ditch defense at the entrance to the throne room, but they were no match for the hardened veterans of the Persian army. The palace doors were smashed open, and the Immortals, their armor caked in mud, but their blades shining, stormed into the great hall. Belshazzar, the proud king who had toasted his own glory with the stolen cups of God, found himself face to face with Harpagus. For a moment he saw not just a soldier, but the embodiment of the writing on the wall, the terrifying agent of a judgment he could no longer escape. His reign and his life had come to an end. The kingdom had been given to the Medes and Persians. The sun rose on a city transformed. The golden splendor of Babylon, once a symbol of unconquerable pride, was now shrouded in the grim aftermath of a swift and brutal conquest. The fighting had been largely confined to the palace and the military garrisons. Cyrus, in a move of strategic genius, had given strict orders to his troops. The lives and property of ordinary citizens were to be spared. There was to be no city-wide sack, No mass slaughter, no burning of homes. This was not a war of annihilation, it was a transfer of power. Cyrus himself did not enter the city in the immediate, bloody aftermath. He remained with his main force outside the walls, allowing General Gobryas, a Babylonian native who had defected to the Persian cause, to secure the city and establish order. This was a calculated political act. By having a familiar Babylonian face oversee the transition, Cyrus mitigated the sense of a hostile foreign takeover. The message was clear. This was not destruction, but a new beginning. For the Jewish exiles, the night had been one of terror and hope, inextricably mixed. Huddled in their homes, they had listened to the sounds of battle, the screams, the clash of steel, and the thunderous roar as the main gates of the city were finally thrown open from the inside to admit the bulk of the Persian army. They prayed, not knowing if they were praying for deliverance or for a swift death. When dawn came, they emerged cautiously into the streets. They saw Persian soldiers, disciplined and watchful, standing guard on every corner. But they did not see the chaos and carnage they had feared. There were no mobs looting shops, no homes being set ablaze. The markets were closed, the citizens behind their doors, but a strange, tense peace held the city. Daniel stood with Ezra on a rooftop, looking out over the conquered metropolis. The great ziggurat of Marduk still stood, but its spiritual authority seemed diminished, a hollow shell. The divine judgment pronounced on the palace wall had been executed with terrifying speed. "He did it," Ezra whispered, his voice trembling with an emotion so profound it was almost painful. Everything the prophet said, the river, the gates, the king, it all came to pass. Daniel nodded, his gaze distant. "The arm of the Lord is mighty, Ezra. He raises up kings, and he casts them down. The Babylonian lion has been slain. Now, we must see the nature of the eagle that has taken its place." A week later, Cyrus, king of Persia, made his formal entry into Babylon. It was a procession unlike any the city had ever seen. There were no carts piled high with decapitated heads, no lines of shackled prisoners paraded in humiliation, no whipping of captives. Cyrus rode not on a towering war chariot, but on a calm, steady horse. He wore the simple but dignified attire of a Persian nobleman, not the ostentatious, jewel-encrusted robes of a Babylonian monarch. His face was stern, but his eyes were intelligent and observant, taking in the city and its people. His soldiers lined the streets, but their spears were pointed to the sky, a sign of peace, not aggression. The people of Babylon, expecting a monster, emerged from their homes and watched in stunned silence. They saw a conqueror who did not act like one. He rode directly to the Exile, the great temple complex of Marduk, the city's chief god, but he did not defile it. Instead, in a gesture that sent shockwaves through the populace, he performed the traditional rites of a Babylonian king, taking the hand of Bel-Marduk, symbolically accepting the god's authority to rule the city. To the priests of Marduk, this was a sign that their traditions and their influence would be preserved. To Cyrus, it was a masterstroke of political theater, a way to legitimize his rule in the eyes of his new subjects. He had conquered their army and taken their king, but he was now conquering their hearts and minds with an unexpected weapon: respect. In the days that followed, this radical policy became clearer. Cyrus established his governance. He declared that life would continue. The local laws, customs, and religions of the Babylonians would be honored. Their property was secure. Their priests could continue their rituals. The machinery of the vast empire would continue to function. Only now, it would answer to a new master in Pasargadaye. For the Jewish community, this period was one of watchful waiting. They were no longer the captives of the king who had destroyed their temple. But what were they now? Simply the subjects of a new empire. Had one cage merely been replaced by another, more gilded one? The answer came in the form of a royal summons. Daniel, who had been retained as a respected advisor due to the events of that fateful night, was called to an audience with the new king. He walked through the familiar halls of the palace, now guarded by Persian immortals, and was led not into the vast, intimidating throne room, but into a smaller, more private chamber. Cyrus was standing by a large window, studying a map of his now vast empire. He turned as Daniel entered. There was no throne, no ceremony. It was just two men, one the most powerful ruler on earth, the other an elderly exile, whose only authority came from his God. "You are the man who read the writing," Cyrus stated. "It was not a question. You serve a powerful God, a God who knows the future." "I serve the one true God, the creator of heaven and earth," Daniel replied calmly. "It is he who revealed the meaning of the words." Cyrus nodded slowly, his eyes studying Daniel with intense curiosity. "My generals tell me your people have been here for a long time, that your city, Jerusalem, was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. For 70 years we have wept by the rivers of Babylon," Daniel said, his voice heavy with the sorrow of generations. "We have dreamed of returning to the land God promised our forefathers." Cyrus was silent for a long moment. He was a pragmatist, a political genius. He understood that a loyal, grateful populace in a strategic region like Judah could be a valuable asset, a buffer against the ever-present threat of Egypt to the south. He knew that allowing captive peoples to return home would foster goodwill and stability throughout his diverse empire. His own inscriptions, which he was already commissioning, would boast of this policy, of his role as a restorer of peoples and cults. His motives were political. But as he looked at this dignified old man, a man who stood before him without fear, whose God had seemingly predicted his own name and actions, Cyrus felt something more than political calculation. He felt the pull of destiny, the sense that his incredible rise to power was part of a story larger than his own ambition. "The God you speak of," Cyrus said, his voice low. "The one who knows the future. What else does he say of me?" Daniel took a breath. This was the moment. He motioned to Ezra, who had been permitted to accompany him, and stood waiting by the door with a scroll. Ezra stepped forward and unrolled the prophecies of Isaiah before the king. With a steady hand, Daniel pointed to the ancient Hebrew script. "He calls you by name, O king," Daniel said, his voice ringing with the authority of the prophet. "He calls you his shepherd, who will accomplish all his purpose. And he says of Jerusalem, 'Let it be rebuilt,' and of the temple, 'Let its foundations be laid.'" He then moved his finger to the most astonishing verse of all. "And here," Daniel said, "he calls you his Anointed One." Cyrus stared at the foreign script. He could not read the words, but he heard the translation from Daniel, and he felt their weight. Anointed One, Messiah, a title of divine appointment. He, a worshipper of Ahura Mazda, the Persian god of light and wisdom, was being claimed by the god of a small captive nation. His political plans, his military strategies, his personal ambitions, had they all been, unknowingly, the work of this unseen Hebrew god? The thought was staggering, humbling, and strangely affirming. It placed his entire life's work into a cosmic context, giving it a meaning beyond mere conquest. He looked from the scroll to Daniel, and then back out the window at the city he now ruled. A decision, which had been forming in his mind for weeks, now solidified into an irrevocable decree. He would not just permit the Jews to leave, he would command it. He would be the shepherd. He would fulfill the prophecy. The days that followed the audience with Daniel were a whirlwind of activity. The imperial scribes were summoned. Cyrus, working with his council and with Daniel providing historical context, began to formulate one of the most remarkable decrees in ancient history. This was not to be a quiet, informal permission slip. Cyrus understood the power of the written word, the weight of a royal edict proclaimed throughout the empire. It needed to be official, undeniable, and permanent. The scribes worked on clay tablets and papyrus scrolls, translating the decree into Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Persian Empire, so it could be read and understood from the mountains of Media to the banks of the Nile. Meanwhile, news of Daniel's meeting with the king spread like a wildfire through the Jewish quarter. The community was electric with anticipation. Every conversation was filled with the name Cyrus. Every prayer now carried a new urgency. Was this it? Was the long night of exile truly over? For many, like the young carpenter Zerubbabel, a man of Davidic descent, the hope was almost too much to bear. He was born in Babylon. Jerusalem was a story told to him by his grandfather, a place of legend. The idea of walking its streets, of seeing the holy mountain with his own eyes, was a dream so potent it made his hands tremble. He began to inspect his tools, not for the work he did in Babylon, but for the work he might one day do in a rebuilt Jerusalem. For others, the feeling was more complex. An older merchant named Sheshbazzar, who had built a comfortable life and a successful business in Babylon, felt a pang of apprehension. To return meant abandoning everything he had built. It meant a long, arduous journey to a land he barely remembered, a land that was now a ruin. It meant starting over in poverty and hardship. The comfort of the cage was a real and powerful temptation. The tension reached its peak on a bright, clear morning. A Persian herald, flanked by a contingent of guards, entered the main square of the Jewish quarter. A crowd gathered instantly, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. The herald unrolled a scroll and, in a loud, clear voice, read the words that would change their world forever. "Thus says Cyrus, King of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. It was real. It was happening. The herald continued, his voice echoing off the brick buildings. "Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. And in any locality where survivors may now be living, the people are to provide them with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with free will offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem." The proclamation was more generous, more astounding than anyone had dared to imagine. It was not just permission to leave, it was a royal commission. It was not just freedom, it was empowerment. They were not being cast out. They were being sent on a holy mission, with the blessing and material support of the most powerful man on earth. But Cyrus was not finished. The herald rolled up the first scroll and took a second from an aide. Furthermore, he announced, "King Cyrus has brought out the articles belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of his God." Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought out by the hand of Mithridath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. The sacred vessels, the golden cups and silver basins they had last seen being desecrated at Belshazzar's feast, they were being returned. The herald began to read from the treasurer's inventory list, and each word was a hammer blow against the memory of their humiliation. 30 gold dishes, 1,000 silver dishes, 29 silver pans, 30 gold bowls, 410 matching silver bowls, 1,000 other articles. In all, there were 5,400 articles of gold and of silver. As the list was read, the abstract numbers became concrete realities in the minds of the listeners. They pictured the sacred treasures, the tangible links to their past, to the glory of Solomon's temple. The return of these items was more than a gesture of goodwill. It was a restoration of honor. It was a healing of a 70-year-old wound. God had not only broken their chains, he was recrowning them with dignity before the very eyes of their former captors. When the herald finished, the square was silent for a moment, the people too stunned to react. Then, a single joyous sob broke the silence. It was followed by another and another, until the entire square was filled with the sound of weeping. But this was not the weeping of sorrow they had known for so long. It was the unrestrained, cathartic weeping of joy, of gratitude, of a deliverance so complete it felt like a dream. People embraced one another, strangers and neighbors alike. Zerubbabel lifted his hands to the sky, tears streaming down his face, shouting praises to God. Ezra the scribe sank to his knees, his forehead pressed to the ground in prayer. Even the cautious Sheshbazzar felt the doubt melt away from his heart, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. He was named in the decree. He, a merchant, was now a prince of Judah, entrusted with the holy task of carrying the Lord's treasures back to the Lord's city. Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the scene unfold. He did not shout or weep. A deep, quiet peace settled over him. He had lived to see this day. He had been a boy when he was taken from his home, and he was now an old man at the end of his days. He had served in the courts of 2 empires, had seen kings rise and fall, had faced down lions and interpreted the fiery writing of God. He knew he was too old to make the journey back himself. His Jerusalem would remain a memory. But he saw the future of his people in the tear-streaked, joyful faces before him. He saw the next chapter of God's story beginning. The prophecy of Isaiah, which had once seemed so cryptic and impossible, was now the official policy of the Persian Empire. The man the prophet had called shepherd was gathering his flock. The man he had called anointed had fulfilled his sacred, if unwitting, task. He had acted out of his own political motives, his own strategic vision, his own sense of imperial destiny. Yet in doing so, he had perfectly aligned himself with the will of a God he did not know, proving that the Lord of heaven could indeed take the right hand of any king on earth and use him to open doors, break down gates, and set his people free. The Anointed One had done his work. Now, the long walk home could begin. The proclamation was not just words on a scroll, it was a catalyst. It transformed the Jewish community from a passive group of exiles into an active, mobilized nation in waiting. The question was no longer if they would return, but who would go and when. It was a seismic shift that revealed the deep roots faith had maintained, even in foreign soil. The first caravan was organized under the leadership of Sheshbazzar. The sight of the sacred vessels being carefully packed for the journey was a powerful symbol that drew many to the cause. Thousands of families made the difficult decision to leave. They sold businesses, packed what few heirlooms they could carry, and said goodbye to the only homes their children had ever known. They were trading the relative security of the world's greatest empire for the uncertainty of a desolate, ruined homeland. It was an act of audacious faith. The journey itself was an epic undertaking, a 4-month trek across nearly 900 miles of harsh, unforgiving terrain. They traveled in a vast, slow-moving column, a river of people and livestock flowing west against the current of history that had brought them there 70 years earlier. They faced scorching deserts, rugged mountains, and the constant threat of bandits. Each night, as they circled their wagons and lit their fires under a canopy of brilliant stars, they would sing the old psalms of ascent, the songs their ancestors had sung on their pilgrimages to the temple. Now, the words had a new, profound meaning. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. And as they traveled, the story of their exodus and its instigator, Cyrus, became a foundational part of their identity. They told the story to their children around the campfires. They spoke of the arrogant king and the writing on the wall, of the miraculous fall of Babylon, and of the pagan king whom God himself had anointed for their sake. Cyrus, for his part, moved on to the other affairs of his vast empire. He likely gave the departing Jews little more thought. His actions, from his perspective, were part of a broader, successful policy of imperial stabilization. He was a master of statecraft, using tolerance as a tool of control, creating a pax Persiana that would last for centuries. He had his own reasons, his own gods, his own ambitions. He would go on to be remembered by the Greeks as a brilliant lawgiver and by the Persians as their founding father. He was, by all worldly measures, the Great. But the narrative being woven by the returning exiles was a theological one. They saw a truth that Cyrus himself could not see. They saw the unseen hand of God guiding the king's political maneuvering. Cyrus's desire for a stable western frontier perfectly served God's plan to re-establish his people in the Promised Land. Cyrus's policy of restoring local cults perfectly served God's plan to rebuild his holy temple. Cyrus's ambition was the vessel. God's purpose was the content. This brings us back to the profound question that began our story. Why call this foreign king the Anointed One? The title was not an honorific bestowed to flatter a friendly ruler. It was a radical theological statement about the nature of God himself. By giving Cyrus this title, the prophet Isaiah was making three crucial points that would redefine Israel's understanding of God's power. First, it declared God's sovereignty over all nations. The God of Israel was not a small tribal deity whose power ended at the borders of Judah. He was the Lord of all history, the king over all kings. He could direct the will of a Persian emperor as easily as he had once directed the staff of Moses. The rise and fall of Babylon and the ascendancy of Persia were not random acts of human history. They were chapters in his divine plan. Second, it demonstrated God's freedom to use any instrument he chooses. He was not confined to working only through his chosen people. In a moment of supreme irony, when Israel was at its lowest point, powerless and in exile, God chose to act through a pagan outsider. He anointed Cyrus not because of Cyrus's faith, but because of his function. Cyrus was God's chosen tool for a specific task. The Bible makes this clear when God says of Cyrus, "I summon you by name and bestow on you a title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me." The power was God's, not Cyrus's. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, it was a profound testament to God's faithfulness to his promise. For 70 years it had seemed that God's covenant with his people was broken, that his promises were void. The anointing of Cyrus was the ultimate proof that God had not forgotten them. Even in their darkest hour, he was already preparing their deliverance in the most unexpected way, naming their savior before he was even a major player on the world stage. It showed that God's plans are never thwarted by human failure or enemy action. When the first caravan, led by Zerubbabel and the high priest Jeshua, finally arrived in the ravaged land of Judah, they fell to their knees. They saw the broken walls of Jerusalem, the weeds growing where the temple courts once stood. It was a daunting sight, but it was home. Their first act was not to build houses for themselves, but to build an altar to the Lord on the rubble of the old one. There, amidst the ruins, with the sacred vessels returned to their possession, they offered their first sacrifice in 70 years. The smoke from the altar rose into the sky, a fragrant prayer of thanksgiving, a symbol of a nation reborn. The story of Cyrus the Great and the Jewish exiles is therefore a dual legacy. In secular history, he is the brilliant founder of the Persian Empire, a unifier and a visionary administrator. But in the sacred history of the Bible, he is something more. He is the unwitting servant, the shepherd, the anointed Oniah, timeless testament to a God who holds the fate of nations in his hands, who writes his will into the ambitions of kings, and who can call a light out of the deepest darkness to fulfill his unbreakable promises. He is the answer to a prayer a nation had almost given up on, and the ultimate proof that the stage of human history is, and always will be, directed by a divine and unseen hand.